Hello there, and welcome to the Second Sensory podcast from Clive, who could be over there.
Hello, Richard, and hello to everybody that's watching this podcast, whenever you are watching it. My name's Clive Smith.
I'm Richard Hurstwood, and we want to talk today about how you actually design a multi-sensory room or even a sensory space, because I think it's important to think about both. And, getting the design right is very individual to the learner. A little like in the last podcast, we were talking about how you use it. That's about knowing your learner. How you design it is down to knowing what you're going to actually do in there.
Design. We need to make sure that that room that we're going to be using is, use that old cliche, fit for purpose. We need to make sure that whatever students we're going to be working with, that the room will be able to accommodate them. Now, that is a really big ask. I mean, we can have children with cognitive impairments. We can have children with sensory impairments. There'll be wheelchair users. There may be children on the autistic spectrum. And in a lot of places, I know people in mainstream schools are now starting to use sensory rooms. So we've got to really give a lot of thought to the design to ensure that we actually meet all of their needs. There is a great danger when you start to set up your sensory room, you get a bit giddy and you chuck everything into it. You think, oh, that'll be good. We'll put in this, we'll put in that. And what you actually end up with is a cluttered room that doesn't really achieve anything. So we need to really think carefully about the design.
And I think we're going to use the term students and children all the way through this because, at the end of the day, sensory rooms are for all different ages, all different abilities. I've got a kind of sensory room 2 stories down from me here right now, and I absolutely love being in there. One of the first things we may need to concern ourselves about is size. What size should a space be? The truth is that more often than not, somebody will say, we need a sensory room. And somebody will then say, well, we've got that cupboard there, or we've got that garage there, or we've got that classroom spare. Unlikely. But then we've got this space, and you're going to be given a space. And then it's going to be up to you to design it and populate it with the equipment itself. But size is a big consideration.
It's totally true, Richard. Quite often if you're setting up a new sensory room, you're going to be given a room. You're not going to have a lot of choice about it. But I think if you really give some consideration to size, if the senior management, let's whisper it, are trying to push you into the direction of a small cupboard down the road, you can actually say to them, look, it's not going to work. It doesn't matter how much money we put. If it's not the right size, we're going to fail from the very outset. So, yeah, there's not a lot we can do, but giving you some information so you can stand the ground and get the best that you want. And a medium-sized room, slightly smaller than, the average classroom, would be really terrific. But whatever, the room has got to have enough space to be able to work with 6 students, maybe a couple of members of staff. You've got to think, how many people are going to get into this room? And so we need, but for me, the absolute crucial point is there needs to be enough space to have clear, uncluttered working area. That's the flaw for us in sensory rooms.
If you're working with just one-to-one, then, a small room is going to suffice. But if you are going to be working with bigger groups, then this room that I've got here, pretty good size. I could get a group of 6 or 8 in here, and we could have quite a lot of space to move around because, a lot of our learners who have autism or are autistic will like to walk at first. We may need room for a lot of wheelchairs in there. You might need room for a portable hoist. So you've really got to think about the size thing. The next thing you need to think about in the initial planning stages is the floor covering. What kind of floor covering do you need? Sometimes you may need washable, sometimes you may need comfortable. The floor is a really important space.
You'll have gathered from my previous comments about having an uncluttered floor that I'm not really a fan of the sensory rooms which have large areas of the floor covered in very thick, soft clay. They make it difficult to move. They make it difficult to walk upon. They limit your uses. I'd always advocate a flooring that's tough, cleanable if possible. There are going to be materials spilt at some time in its life. Hard wearing, but comfortable enough to be able to sit directly on the floor. None of that sort of rough carpet that really prickles after a while. So again, we're attempting to find a surface that meets everyone's needs, and it's always going to be difficult. There needs to be space for wheelchairs to come into the room. There needs to be space for the wheelchairs to be moved around the room quite easily. So they may be moving from, in Richard's case, from the bubble tube in one corner to the wall, the projection wall in the other. And so the surface does need to be solid. And this is where I sort of don't go along with the soft play or matting on the floor, so that students themselves are not struggling to sit up. They're not struggling if they've got poor core strength to keep an upright position. You're not struggling if you need to walk across it and to get stuff from shelves or from cupboards in the room. So let's look at a fairly clear, uncluttered, solid floor. We'll talk about things that you may add in later on when we discuss furniture for the room.
And that's where we'll talk about soft floor matting and maybe some designs which could work very well in a multi-sensory room. Now, the other one which gets a lot of people talking is the colour. And you know what? We get all sorts of views on this. I mean, I've been into rooms that have been green. They've done the whole room green. I ended up calling it the Kermit room. But it was just purely green because they told the people who were building the room that green was a colour for relaxation. Yes, it is, and it's a very natural colour, but a little like blue. It can be a very cold colour in some sort of spaces. So making a room that's green or blue, maybe, but I don't think so. There's much better colours to use in your room.
Colour in the room, the colour of the walls, it's a really contentious issue. Lots of people will come into the room and say, oh, it's white. I wanted a dark room. Oh, it's dark. I can't see what I'm doing. I want a light room. When I'm working with students in a sensory room, I'm quite often focusing upon concentration, getting them to pay attention, to attend to the sensory objects that we're using, the lights or whatever. So I tend to prefer having a dark background because black soaks up light. Whatever I'm using will stand out from it. But again, if you have a totally dark room, it's not restful. It's claustrophobic. And so I'm in favor of a bit halfway. I like to have a wall that's dark. I like to have a floor that's dark, but I like to have the rest of the walls in a fairly light, neutral color.
A light neutral color could be something like an ivory color, because as you can see here, I've got an ivory colored wall, but the colored lighting is actually what's going to help us change the mood of the room, not the actual color of the wall. Remember, we said in the last podcast that we need to be able to control the environment. So although I've got multicolored switched on here at the minute, you can see that we could make that blue to cool everything down. We could make it red to be more invigorating. So having a light colored wall works really well. And if you're going to project any light onto a wall, it will be brighter against a white surface. So trying to think of 3 lighter colored walls, 1 darker colored wall. Now, all of this is going to be completely wasted if you don't get the blackout right in a room. In other words, to be able to control the light in a sensory room, we don't want light bleed coming in from skylights, coming in from windows, coming in from anywhere, because we really need to be able to focus the light. So having a darkened space, now, don't get me wrong, I'm not always going to work in a darkened space. Sometimes I'm going to work in a room which is lit, but maybe a little bit more dull. So getting blackout right, not having sunlight coming into the room most of the time, really works well.
I think Richard's covered a lot of the major points there about blackout. There are lots of options, particularly if the room that you've been given is going to be multi-purpose, because sometimes we're given an area we can use as a sensory room, but it's also going to be used for that. It's going to be used for this. It's going to be used for other things. So sometimes we need to be able to, let the light back in. But one of the things, I think, whatever you're doing, whatever your system you're working, because in the last podcast, Richard said the reason for the sensory room is a place where we can control the sensory stimulus. And we need to be able to do that. And so it's really important that one of the things you do look to build into the budget for this room is good quality blackout. Blackout that, as Richard said, won't allow light bleed coming in from the edges. I often find that if I'm working in a room where there is light bleed coming in round blinds or an improvised blackout that's been put up, some of our students that are on the autistic spectrum get totally fixated on that little bit of light color that comes in. So yeah, blackout important, and important enough to make it a major part of your budget when you're setting up that room.
And blackout blinds are not going to be cheap. However, roller blinds don't work that well. Venetian blinds don't work that well because they let light through the sides or through the edges. A cheap way, well, cheapish way to do it is to put Velcro around your window frame and Velcro blackout material around the frame itself. That way, if somebody rips it down, they're pulling the Velcro down. And that really isn't a worry, because do remember the curtains for some of our learners are just particularly made for swinging on. That's what they're going to do. They're going to grab them, they're going to pull them. And for that reason, sometimes the blackout material will actually put on the other side, on the outside of the window rather than on the inside. You want to be able to let sunlight in for cleaning and for those learners who don't want to walk into a black hole. So when you're thinking about blackout, think about flexibility. How can you either pull it down or wind it up or get rid of it, but then quickly and easily, ready for the next session, be able to make your room very, very dark. Now, when you start blacking rooms out, when you start using lighting, when you start to use effects, the rooms very often start to heat up, especially if you're in Australia or New Zealand. Here in the UK, the room's probably absolutely freezing today because we're in -5 at the moment. So ventilation and heating is going to be another issue if you've got the budget for it.
Yes, as somebody whose work in the past has involved me spending almost full days in sensory rooms, I can really concur with what Richard says. And even on those days when it's been freezing, get half a dozen pupils, a couple of staff in, get some lighting effects going, and all of a sudden that room does start to heat up, does start to get quite warm. And for a lot of our students who may have complex medical issues, that's not going to be conducive for them working. For some of the children on the autistic spectrum, the sensory overload from getting too hot can be too much. So we do need to think about how we're going to control the heat. In this country, air conditioning is not generally a sort of a considered feature of school builds. It's never been an issue. And you may think, well, we'll put a fan in. No, fans are great sensory stimulus. They're not really suitable to have on permanently to try and cool the room down. If it's needed, maybe you could look at a portable air conditioning unit as something that can be brought in when it's really needed. I mean, air conditioning units, you could pay anything, but I mean, you are starting from probably £400 upwards to look at a portable air conditioning unit. And that may be, beneficial in getting much better work out of the students that are in the sensory room.
I think the other thing you've got to bear in mind is often air conditioning, fans, those kind of things can make a lot of noise. And that is the other thing you've got to be careful of. That when you switch the fan on, it doesn't go like that and just disrupt absolutely everybody, which quite a lot of the time, it really can. So think about the temperature in the room. Aircon, fantastic. But most of us really can't afford that. So we've got to think of other ways of cooling the room. And sometimes just a little hand fan can really just help a little situation, especially if you're in a small little one-to-one room. Now, the other thing we feel strongly about in sensory rooms is a place for everything and everything in its place. There's nothing worse than working with a particular learner, especially PMLD or autism, and you need a tool. And then you have to disappear to go and get it. And then try and rummage around the storeroom and then come back and you've got it. No. You need to know where the tools are. For example, if I want an ion party ball, it's right there. If I need a big spinny turny light, it's right there. I know where everything is and I know how to get to it very quickly. This is down to having effective storage. And the other thing about storage is it does mean that people tend to put things back if there's a place for it.
I really do think that in designing your room, you overlook the whole issue of storage at your peril. Good storage is the key to successful work for the reasons that Richard's just said, being able to have all the correct stuff to hand. And I mean, I know that you'll go in and I know you will have planned your sensory session and you will have your box of sensory toys, sensory items all ready. But there's going to be that occasion when the student takes you off in a completely different direction. And you're going to think, this is great, but I need a light up ball to go with this route, or I need a noisemaker, or I need something else. If you need to stand up and then start hunting, even in your cupboards for that, you're going to lose that moment. So we do need to have effective storage. I like to see a good set of shelves there, but shelves in a sensory room are going to take up a fair bit of your space, particularly if they have hinged doors. Hinged doors, I don't think, are a great idea because they open into the room. They're going to distract people when you're doing. I prefer to shelves if they're going to be there, and we do have to protect what's on the shelves from prying hands. I prefer the sort of shelving that has roller shutters on the front, so it's quickly slid up. It can be doesn't get in the way of what you're doing within the room. So if your room's so small, then you may have to think about the storage outside the room. And if you do have to go down that route, then as Richard's just indicated, having some good storage kits. Now, there are a lot. If you've seen Richard and I on a course, we constantly use toolboxes. You'll find us rooting around in the middle aisles of two well-known supermarkets or a well-known DIY supermarkets and coming back with small boxes for small objects, torches, little handheld fans, those sort of things, or larger toolboxes for bigger equipment. But that way you can get it into the room quickly and still have the stuff to hand.
Yeah, sometimes obviously portable storage like this in toolboxes can work really well. I quite like that. That's a Stanley screw box or little toolbox. Works fabulously well. But a cupboard, remember, you need a lock on the cupboard because once some of our learners find out where that stuff is, they're going to be in there all the time. Also, make the cupboard, well, it's likely best to make the cupboard a contrasting colour to the walls so people can see where the cupboard actually is. Sounds daft, but it really works well. The last two, furniture. Now, furniture is really important in a sensory space because we want people to be comfortable, to work effectively. We need people to be in the right position to be able to work effectively. So that means that we've got to think about our furniture. Sensory companies love soft matting, and there's a good reason for that because it is probably the most profitable bit of a sensory room. It can work really, really well. Now, I'm not saying don't put soft matting in because it can work well, but if you are going to put any floor mats in there, make them reversible. Dark blue on one side, ivory colour on the other side. So you can flip the mat over, you can work against a dark surface, or you can work against a light surface. I love The folding mats. That was my timer to tell me that time's up. I love folding mats. I'll put a picture of them right here and you'll be able to see. They are absolutely wonderful.
Yeah, I've not got much more to say on furniture, except we've focused on sensory rooms in the establishments. You may be creating a sensory room at home. If you're doing it in your home, it's going to be a dual purpose area. There are available some very nice fold-up mats online. They're normally for gym activities, but they come in a little carry bag and they're great. And they're ideal for people working at home, just to have that soft matting area.
Now, let's think about electrics in the room. You know, you're going to have a lot of mains operated equipment, and how it's done is very much down to your local regulations. Remember, you may have regulations that say sockets have got to be particular height. You may have to put it into trunking. You may have to put it, you know, electrics just vary so much across the UK and across the world. But let me just say, when I'm thinking about designing socket places, where do you put sockets? I like low sockets down here, about 30 centimeters away from the ground, because that way, if I've got floor mounted fiber optics, which I actually have there, and then I can just plug in my fiber optic there. If I'm going to run projectors, I may need a shelf up here. So I normally say 6 feet. What's 6 feet in real money, Clive?
1.8 meters or 180 centimeters.
Fantastic. So about 1.8 to 1.9 meters would be best. About there, sockets there, you put your shelf there, you put your projector on there, safety cable. Some people have portable mirror balls that are put on a shelf. Again, safety cable, chain it up to the shelf. But the thing we've got to avoid is trailing leads, and Clive's going to tell you about trailing leads.
Yes, one of the things that's an absolute no-no in any sensory room is having those four-way sockets dangling from a plug up in the ceiling or trailing across the floor. We don't want that. They have no place in a room. So again, I keep talking about the budget, but you need to budget for a proper electrical installation. Now, once upon a time, quite often we would want to put in switching sockets, and that was the very complex operation, and we would get a bespoke input from the sensory company. They'd design us some software to go with it. The whole world has changed so much in the last few years. Smart sockets are so cheaply available. They can be placed in the upper areas or the hard to reach areas, and it gives us voice control over equipment. It gives the students voice control over the equipment. And so it's something to start thinking about, and we can control the equipment without leaving the student by using voice control or by using a simple app on our tablets, whatever it is. So it's another new area that's changing things all the time for us.
I think the switch systems which are manufactured by some of the specialist companies are fantastic. They really work well, especially if you understand momentary latched and timed. But yeah, as Clive says, there's a lot of systems around it you can get from Amazon or eBay, which will work really, really well. There is one last little one that I wanted to just slip in at the end here, and that's, you know, very often I need to have my hands free when I'm working. So I do like to have cables or rigs so that I can basically just hang stuff. And yeah, this is not going to be appropriate for everybody, but you can see here I've got an IKEA tray. I've just hung it on my rig, and then I can just shine my light on there and get it really near the student, which can be fantastic. So think about how can you hang stuff in your room. It's going to work really well. So the room I've got here, well, this is a really good example. This was designed by Mike Ayres. And as you can see, light wall, dark carpet, the room color and the room mood is controlled by the lighting. In other words, we have control of the space. And that's what you've got to think about when you're designing your multisensory room. How can you control it?
I know that if you're being asked to revamp a room, build a room from scratch, you're going to get really enthusiastic about it, but take some time. Think of all these elements that we've spoken about and draw up a list of which of the things you can do easily, which are the things that you need budgeting for. just make sure that you give it enough thought so your sensory room really does work.
So that's it for podcast number 2 about design. Next week, what we're going to talk about is the equipment itself. What equipment should you put in? What's the difference between expensive equipment and cheap equipment? What should you be buying? We'll give you some advice on that. So that's it. Thank you very much for watching and see you next time.
Bye-bye.